Hello, ladies and gentlemen, and welcome to another edition of Mr. American's Moments in History, U.S. History Edition. Today we're going to wrap up our discussion on the Great Depression and the New Deal, certainly before we make our way into World War II. And starting off with this photograph, so certainly for my students, this is a great example of a picnic or a park shelter in Whitewater State Park, and for those of you who are unfamiliar, again, that's here in southeastern Minnesota. But just a great example of the Workers' Progress Administration, which we'll talk a little bit more as kind of a part of the second New Deal as we go through kind of wrapping up New Deal and the Great Depression today. But great example of some local history that I wanted to bring in for my students. What we're going to be able to do today, we're going to be able to identify why during this time period in the mid-1930s, Roosevelt's New Deal began to face growing opposition. And we'll talk a little bit about how FDR tried to deal with that opposition, specifically with the Supreme Court. So one of the things that we see, throughout U.S. history is this relationship between big business and business leaders and then the government. Certainly we saw it with the Gilded Age. Business leaders had a lot of power, whether it was your Rockefellers, your Carnegies, the other robber barons or titans of industry, however you want to refer to them. They were used to a very hands-off approach in the government. And a lot of businesses seen something similar in the 20s. Progressive era really hammered down, made sure, it increased government involvement. The 20s was a little bit more hands-off, and now as we get into the 30s, you're cranking up the government's role. And so business leaders felt threatened by this government expansion, this sense of growing power, and they wanted the government to kind of take a little bit more of that hands-off and kind of leave them alone, similar to probably what they experienced in the 1920s, play a little bit less active of a role in the economy, and instead let them run things the way they wanted to run them. So in a sense, get a little bit out of their realm, if you will. Others at the same time felt the government wasn't doing enough, and they developed these schemes or these plans to try to give a new vision. And in some cases, you saw this development of demagogues, these people who were, in the case of Father Charles Coughlin, for example, literally were preaching these ideas that they have. And in many ways, they were preying on people's fears and frustrations from the Great Depression to sort of lend to their own either political power or in some cases their monetary. I want to start with Father Charles Coughlin, who's not pictured here. This actually is Senator Huey Long, who we'll get to the Kingfish in just a second. Let's start with Father Charles Coughlin, though. Coughlin is a priest, and he's going to really ratchet up the churches, and the Catholic Church in particular's involvement in politics. He's going to host a weekly radio show, and with it he's going to gain thousands and later millions of viewers. And as he does that, he starts to kind of lay the foundation for modern televangelists, like your Billy Grahams, for example. And he gains this following, and he's starting to have even a little bit more influence on politics. And he even uses some of that to collect some money. He eventually helps build a church, and I think the church was worth like over $1 million when it was built at the time, which was a lot for the time period. But he tends to later, in closer to the 1940s, starts to get a little bit more radical. He tends to have some more anti-Semitic views, and he's even put in closer to 1942, so certainly towards World War II. He's even connected with some pro-Nazi language, and so he actually ends up on a person of interest for the FBI in 1942. Another great example is Francis Townsend. Townsend was calling for this the idea of a monthly pension for older or retired Americans. And in many ways, this is actually foreshadowing where we're going later with FDR with Social Security. But a pension is, again, the sum of money that's generally paid regularly to a person, usually after retirement. Social Security is going to be that through the government, but pensions are sometimes given, depending on your profession, as part of your retirement. Once you've put in so many years and you reach a certain age, sometimes you are eligible for a pension. And you can get that through the public sector sometimes, like teachers can sometimes get a pension if they work in public schools. Sometimes police officers get them, sometimes firefighters get them. But also you can certainly get them through the private sector too. And so, again, it depends on your profession, but certainly that can be provided. But you're going to see that with Social Security too, which we'll get to in just a second. And then you've got, again, Senator Huey Long. Huey Long is essentially calling for heavier taxation on the rich. And his plan, and he's a politician from Louisiana who has this idea of trying to create a more ideal situation for workers. He wants a mandatory 30-hour work week. He wants to ensure that all families are, for sure getting an income between $1,000 and $2,000 a month, and should be ideally guaranteed at least $5,000 annually. He also believes that he can help pay for college education for deserving students. And so in some ways, he's kind of a little bit of the precursor to some of the more socialist ideas that the world will adopt in some places later in the world, while also providing, of course, a safety net for those who were retired and also for those who were unemployed. He also was calling for a month of vacation, so for everybody. And the idea, again, in some ways, might sound to us a little bit like some of the nations who have more socialist-like governments. In 1935, Roosevelt is going to launch another set of programs and reforms. Sometimes this is called the second wave of the New Deal. Other times it's called the Second New Deal. And we've certainly, we've gone through alphabet soup, but I want to add certainly one more in this kind of wave. And that's the WPA, the Workers' Progress Administration. This one focuses on employment. The idea is to help generate new jobs and to help sort of tackle the unemployment rate, which, remember, nationally at its worst was at about 25%. Unfortunately, nationally, it's never going to really get below about 12%. And so while the WPA certainly, again, was very helpful to workers, it doesn't ultimately change or doesn't ultimately reach the goals of getting, again, below 5%. For my students, you might recognize this as a great example of a WPA program or activity that was through the WPA, and this is at the Minnesota State Zoo in the Twin Cities. Again, we talked a little bit about the whitewater programs, certainly at the state park. Again, getting a little bit closer, this is in Rochester, Minnesota. This is the Mayo Medical School, which was originally, again, built by the WPA. And this, again, is close to downtown Rochester, and more like the Mayo Clinic campus. This one also is probably a little bit more even closer for my students. And for my students, pause here for a second and see if you can guess where this is. This is really close to home for all of you. And again, pause if you need to. But I'm wondering if this picture will help you. So that's over by the pool in Casa, Minnesota. So that is a great example of a WPA program. Again, helping put people to work during the Great Depression. There you go. A little bit of local history for you. Another big part of the, and certainly a legacy that continues today of the New Deal, is the Social Security Act. We, again, just refer to it as Social Security today. This basically helps to establish a tax on workers that essentially you pay into, your employer matches your contributions, and this helps to provide monthly pensions for retired people. And this was an act, again, that helped to launch some of the American welfare system, again, increasing that standard of living. However, today, it not only supports retired people, but it helps to help people who struggle with a disability. And it also has even gone towards helping provide services to children. In fact, Social Security today provides more support for children across the United States than any other program. When we look at 1940, for every worker that you have, essentially we're having a system where you might have 5 people being supported by that particular income from Social Security. Fast forwarding to 2010, that ratio gets down to about 1 to 2. And so certainly there are a ton of great videos out there that help to explain it, and students, I'll have you watch one in class with me, and we'll talk a little bit about it. But the idea being that sometimes you hear things about Social Security not being built to last, but it has endured the Great Depression, several recessions, and was also designed to certainly endure this the largest generation in history, the baby boomers, which are going to come after World War II, in their retirement. So certainly, again, encourage you. There's some really great videos out there that highlight certainly why Social Security, is certainly built to endure. You're also going to see there's going to be a tax on employers. This is going to go out to help pay for unemployment insurance for people who have lost their jobs, kind of help them stay afloat, help them support their families. You're also going to see John L. Lewis in Congress, the Congress of the Industrial Organizations. They're going to help continue to set up unions through collective bargaining and other means, start to certainly help reshape the United States and especially support workers. They support both skilled and unskilled workers during the Great Depression. And certainly coming out of the Great Depression, helped to kind of usher in a time period of essentially more support for workers as we get into the 40s and 50s especially. And then you've got the Fair Labor Standards Act. This helps to ban child labor in the United States and also helps to set up a minimum wage. So some of this we talked about with the Progressive Era, but you're seeing it come to fruition in the 30s under FDR's administration and in the New Deal. Where I want to wrap up for today is a little bit of FDR's attempt at trying to hold on to power and also where some of the criticism comes in. So starting in 1935, Supreme Court actually started to declare parts of the New Deal legislation unconstitutional, in which the government had been overstepping its bounds, specifically the president's actions. So with that happening, after winning re-election in 1936, FDR is essentially going to go and ask Congress to help him increase the number of justices on the Supreme Court. Now, he's doing this because he thinks if he can put more, if he, quote, can pack the court with more of his appointees that he know will support his New Deal ideas, he can keep them in place and hopefully help the country recover more quickly. And he wants to increase that number from 9 justices to 15. He wants to essentially add 6 new positions, again, helping to, in his mind, appoint justices who would help uphold the New Deal. He's not going to have the votes for it, and in many ways for FDR, this was a sign of him losing a little bit of power, and certainly was a humbling experience to him. Fortunately for FDR, this largely gets dropped after he wins a couple of victories in the Supreme Court, because the Supreme Court is going to start to sponsor his ideas on mediating businesses, specifically through the Wagner Act, and then also it upholds the Social Security Act. So two of the high points, certainly, that he was trying to help regulate as part of his New Deal plans, certainly get upheld. And so for the most part, he largely dropped the issue. And so that's where we're going to wrap up the New Deal and the Great Depression. More to come on kind of the process of getting out of the Great Depression, which ultimately happens with mobilization for World War II. And again, the attack on Pearl Harbor is going to be fundamental to bringing the United States into World War II. But again, that's a story for another day, and we will get to that and the beginnings of World War II for the United States when we get to another edition of Mr. Merrigan's Moments in History. Until then, thanks for listening.